In this demonstration, I'm going to sew the sleeveless Cora blouse with the cowl neck and the back opening. So the back opening is exactly the same as for the front opening. You can follow the same directions. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is sew the darts. So I've got a pin where the apex of the dart is, and I've got notches on the side to show me where to fold it. I could draw on the dart stitching lines and use a friction pen, which I would test first on a scrap just to check that it actually does erase with heat. But this time I want to show you how I sew it without. I've put the pin through the apex so that it's flat. It's actually catching a couple of millimeters of fabric. Then I fold the fabric in half, right sides together, matching the little notch and folding towards that pin. And because that pin is actually going through a couple of millimeters, it helps snap that into a fold. So I'm going to put that under the machine. This fabric's a little bit slippery. It's a beautiful silk crepe. It's got a lovely drape. And I'm going to start sewing from the side towards the apex. So I've got it started. I've got my pin there, it's sitting flat, and I just tap the fabric with my fingers and sew towards the pin. When I get close to the pin, I remove it because you should never sew over pins. Sew off the edge of the fold, back tack, sew forward a single stitch and take it out. I'll do that to the other side, same deal. Folding it over, matching the little snips that I've used to mark the notches, putting that under the foot, and then just using that pin going through a couple of millimeters to just snap it into place along the fold, sewing along towards the pin, remove the pin, sew off the edge of the fold, back tack, stitch forward and take it out. Now I'm going to press those darts so that they face downwards towards the hem. So I'm going to line up the binding, wrong sides together because I'm sewing on the right side. My seam allowance here is very narrow. It's 0.7 millimeters. So I'm just going to start sewing, and you can see because I've got that bit behind, it's supported. A little bit of sewing. And I'm going to sew down, keeping the opening parallel to that binding strip. But then when I get close to where the opening finishes, and I'm just going to draw this on for you. This pen's a bit chunky. My stitching line is going to have to come to the point of the apex there. So what I need to do is actually open or pull the blouse over so that there is the apex of the opening is actually in line with my seam allowance, and I can see the binding underneath. So I'm going to sew towards that little dot that I made, and you might want to just hand turn your needle to get it in exactly the right place. So needle down, and then we're going to pivot. So we're going to bring the blouse around. So the binding is now straight and the blouse comes around, and then I'm going to just angle this top part of the blouse till it meets the seam allowance and is parallel there. Keeping my seam allowance, back tacking when I've finished. I'll hold this up so you can see what I mean. You can see I've sort of pulled the blouse material over so that I've got a consistent seam allowance on the actual binding piece, and then when I pivoted so that on the back the binding is straight, the seam allowance is even, but when I turn it to the right side you can see it just sort of pulls in, and that's to allow me to get a really nice sharp point. So keeping it the same way up, I'm going to open out the binding, And at this point you might like to give it a press if it's a bit bouncy, your material. This is a little bit bouncy, but I'm going to try without it anyway, so that the seam allowance is facing into the binding. And this is again why it's good to have that little bit at the top, because I can just fold that seam allowance over and hold that with my fingers, and then just, ooh, this is very slippery fabric. So folding the two edges in together and then over and putting it under the foot. Now it doesn't matter that it's a bit messy up that end, that's why we've got that little bit, so it's just something to hold it under the foot. And then we're going to fold the edge of the binding to the edge of the seam allowance and over, and I'm just going to give that a little pull and see how that just snaps into place. I don't need pins, this actually gives me more control. And then I just bring that over, so I'm sewing nice and close to the edge. And if I pause with the needle down. Again, lining up those edges. So it's about 10 centimeters away, give that a little pull. And then the folded edge of the binding is sitting exactly on top of the stitching that I have just done. And again, just pausing with the needle down. Now I'm coming up to the point, so I'm going to bring the blouse fabric over, and I'm only working with the binding, so I'm not stretching the binding either because I don't want it to twist. Holding it at the point, giving that a little pull to snap it into place. It's all on the straight grain, so it's not going to stretch. I'm at the apex, so needle down, opening out the binding, keeping the seam allowance facing the binding, give that a little pull. And just, I can slide my fingernail in there if the seam allowance looks like it's coming forward. Sewing on the edge, again pausing, and you can see now because I've got this bit on the end, I can really hold that and control what I'm doing. Sliding my nail along to tuck in that seam allowance and sewing along. And I'm just going to back tack at the end, but carry on the seam so that I've got more control, like so. So you can just see the purple dot that I made for the pivoting point. So that's the right side, it's beautifully sewn, and on the wrong side it's beautifully sewn. So what we're going to do is put the right sides together, and if you match the neckline and bring that down, can you see how where the centre back fold is, that you've got this sort of little bit from the binding. So what we want to do is actually sew a diagonal to flatten that. So I'll just draw that on so it's a little bit more clear. So we're just drawing straight down to the fold. So basically where that fold line is of the centre back, you can draw a line straight up. And we're just going to sew that to mitre it. And what you can do is actually just keep open the whole blouse so it's nice and flat, and you're guaranteeing that that is exactly your back fold, like so. And what I do is I don't start sewing right on the edge. I come down a couple of millimeters, put my needle down, back tack up, and then come forward exactly to the fold, and back tack again. And you might like to have this on a slightly smaller stitch. So you can see there's the fold line. Now I'm going to give that a press so that on the right side, just hold this drapey fabric, you've got that nice finish on your opening. I'll give that a press and show you. So I've pressed that neck opening from the right side. You can see I've got a beautiful point and it's sitting nice and flat. From the wrong side, you can see that the little mitering that I sewed is just pressed to one side so that it does sit flat. Now the next thing we need to do is sew the shoulder seams, but before I do that I'm now going to trim off the excess of those two bits so that my neck is now sitting clean. So that's the right side, and I take the front and we put right sides together along the shoulder, matching the shoulder seams, and I'm just going to sew across with my 1 centimetre seam allowance. I'm matching that. And I'm going to do the trick that I always like to do, which is chaining on, which is where I just bring it over. So rather than taking it out of the machine, I'm just going to carry on sewing along. So it's matched up. Take it out of the machine. Now I am ready to overlock that shoulder seam, and I'm going to press it towards the back. Okay, I've sewn and overlocked and pressed my shoulder seam towards the back. Now we're ready to work on the cowl for the neck. So we're going to start off by making the rouleaus for the buttons. We're going to take our rouleau strip, which is too wide and too long, and again that's to give us the flexibility to work easily. So depending on your material will depend on how fine you can make your rouleau. This is very soft and slippery silk, so I can get quite fine, but if it didn't sort of slide so much it would be more difficult. Doing the rouleau on the straight grain is easier than doing it on the bias, but if you do it on the bias you can also get a thinner loop because it will stretch. The choice is up to you. So I'm going to start sewing. So I put it underneath the foot, fold it in half, keeping it straight because I don't want it to twist. And I'm just going to do a few stitches to get started. That gives me some control over the material. Now I'm sewing with this foot so that the fold of the material sits in the middle of the foot. That's my directional line rather than drawing it on. I'm going to sew to the end, back tack and take that out. And you can see that's how narrow I've made my rouleau. Now I'm going to trim the rouleau. So I want the seam allowance of the rouleau to be slightly less than the actual width of the rouleau, like so. And now I'm going to take my rouleau turner. These things can take a little bit of practice to get used to, but once you do, my goodness, they're a game changer. So I'm going to bring the little hook up, like so, fold that over, and then you just pinch it between your finger and thumb and just gently pull, and it turns it through back on itself, like so. How perfect is that? Now I'm going to give that a press so that the seam is on one side and the fold is on the other. Now we're going to cut the rouleaus to size. So because I've turned that through, the ends are always a little bit sort of ratty, and that's why I make the rouleau a bit longer. So I'm just going to trim the end off, and then I'm going to cut the rouleau to 5 centimetres, and then I'll just do one more. So I've got 2 loops. So you can see there is a bit of wastage, but it's better to have a bit of wastage and have nice neat rouleaus than to try and sort of make everything work within a specific amount of fabric. Then we're going to take our bias cowl, and you will have marked the notches. So this is the right side of the fabric, and I've got my notches facing towards the right, and then I'm going to pin and then baste my rouleaus on. So I'm folding the rouleaus like this so that the ends are flat together and it sort of is sitting like that. So I'm just going to pop them into place. They're kind of tricky to pin. Sometimes I just don't bother pinning, but for this, in fact I'm not going to pin the top one. So I've pinned the second one into place, and now I'm just going to baste. So again, folding the rouleaus, and I'm just going to pop them on top of the notch. And what I like to do is use my unpicker as a sewing tool. So I'm just going to start sewing slightly in from the seam allowance. Now see how I can use my unpicker to get the rouleau sitting really nice and close underneath the foot of the sewing machine without risking sewing over my fingers. And you can see that because I've got the pins there, it's causing a lump in the fabric, and that's really hard to manage, especially because this cowl is on the bias. So if I take those pins out, hold them in place using my ruler, and you can see I can hold the two ends of the ruler nicely and just sew along all the way to the end. Needle up and take the material out and snip those threads. And my little rouleaus are basted into position. Now I can finish off the cowl. So I'm going to fold the cowl over in half, right sides together, and this time I'm going to start sewing from the cut edge towards the fold. And the reason I do that is because it is a little bit stretchy because it's cut on the bias, and this means that as I'm sewing towards that fold, if it does move even slightly, it's fine because it's just going into that fold. Whereas if I was to sew towards the cut end, if that shifted, I might end up with a bit of an overlap. So we'll take that out, snip the threads, and do the same on the other side. So again, sewing from the cut edge towards the fold. 1 centimetre seam allowance. Now, even though it does move, I'm trying not to stretch it. It's important that we don't stretch it. Okay, I can take that one out. Snip the threads. Then I'm going to turn it through. So the way I like to do it is I put my thumb inside the material, take that little folded edge, pinch it between my finger and thumb, and turn that through. And you can see I get this nice crisp edge, and if we hold that up to the light, I don't know if you can see, the edge of the material is sitting on the edge of the fold, and that's a really good little trick. I'll do the same on the other side. Pinching between my finger and thumb and turning through to get a nice sharp edge, and there you can see the little rouleaus poking through beautifully, and there's a little bit of a thread. I'll just trim that off. Don't want that. Beautiful little rouleaus. Now I'm going to give that a press, but I'm only pressing along the seam line, not on the fold, because I want that to drape over the neck, and if I press a fold into there, it's not going to sit properly. I've pressed my cowl, and you can see the rouleaus are sitting nicely, and the other end where the buttons will go is also flat, but not the top edge. So now I'm going to take my blouse and I'm going to open it so it's the right way out. The centre back is obvious because we've got an opening there. The shoulders are obvious because there's a seam, but you just want to mark the centre front with a pin. I've got a little notch in there, but I'm just going to put a pin in so I can easily see that. With your cowl, you've got notches on your pattern piece that indicate the shoulder, the centre front, and the shoulder. So what we're going to do is we're going to start from, I find it easier to start from the centre front because then I don't get confused and accidentally put the cowl on back to front. So I've got my rouleau loops facing towards my right, and then I'm just going to open it out and pin the centre front of the cowl to the centre front of the blouse, wrong sides together, moving along, and I'm going to pin the shoulder notch on one side and the shoulder notch on the other side. Now the cowl is on the bias and the neckline is off grain because it's a curve, but you can see if you just give it a little pull that does snap together. Next I'm going to pin the edge of the collar to the back neck opening, and I can pop a pin in there just temporarily, and that's going to go under the machine. So I'm going to line up those two centre back edges together, do a little back tucking to hold it in place, and when I pause I like to have the needle down, and then I'm just going to ease that neck onto the cowl, bringing that around so I can see where it is, because we just need to sort of ease that curve of the neck onto the straight of the cowl over the shoulder, bringing it around to the front neck, maintaining that 1 centimetre seam allowance. I'm just going to, as I'm coming around, I'm going to pop a pin in for the back, because when I pressed it, can you see there's a little bit of a fold there, so I just want to make sure that that sews up to the seam and not over the fold, which is easy to do. And we do want that to be a nice sharp edge. Bringing that curve of the neck, easing it onto the straight of the collar. Giving that little pull. Bringing that around. Now the tricky part of this is actually getting that nice and close on the edge. So as I come up to it, I take the pin out, and again I just use my unpicker and I just hold that exactly in place so that as I sew up to it, go right to the edge, back tack, and take that out. So you can see, perfect. Okay, now we're going to turn it over towards the front. If I open it out flat. So I've got my centre front notch on the cowl, and I'm going to bring that over to the centre front neck of the blouse, folding it, lining it up like so. I'm going to pop a pin in. Then I'm going to come to that shoulder notch, fold that over 1 centimetre and match it with the corresponding notch on the cowl and the blouse. Do the same on the other shoulder. Bringing that notch over. Pop a pin in. Again, I don't advise pressing this first, because the pressing can stretch it and you don't want that. So we just have those 3 pins. Then for the end bit, we're going to just open it out, folding that seam allowance and just bringing that over, so that even though I did end up with a little pleat in that press on that edge, that's now been eliminated. I'm going to pop a pin in like that, and I can start sewing. So I'm going to start 1/2 centimetre in, right on the edge, do a couple of stitches forward and then back tack, like so. And then because I've already sewn that seam underneath, I can actually stretch it a little bit so that it snaps into position, but the top part might still be stretchy. See how that appears to be bigger than underneath, even though we know it's actually exactly the same. So if we tuck the seam allowance under and bring that over and give it a little pull, again, this is where my unpicker comes into play, is I can hold that and just slightly ease it so that it pushes together. My unpicker is my favourite sewing tool, not just for unpicking. So I'm going to hold that down. If it looks like a little pleat, I just lift the foot and carry on. And again, this is why I don't use too many pins. I just find that they really can get in the way when you're trying to ease. So sewing right on the edge of that folded seam allowance and just giving the underneath a little pull, which also helps the seam allowance move in. Over the shoulder, towards the centre front. And again, it looks like it's too big, but it's not. It's just that stretchy bias. I'm really able to use my unpicker to ease in and just keep moving and opening out your fabric underneath. The flatter everything is, the easier it is. Okay, I'm getting to the end, so what I've done is I get like I did at the beginning, opening it out, folding over the seam allowance and pulling it forward. But what I do is actually pull it forward a bit too much. I'll pop a pin in so you can see. So it's kind of rolling that way. But the reason I do that is I know that once I get to that part of the sewing, it's going to push it forward, and that way I know that it will actually end up being completely flat. Sew to the end, back tack, stitch forward and take it out. So you can see that end, nice and crisp, and that's because I pushed it slightly that way so that when I finish sewing it would sit neatly. Okay, and now I'm going to just give that a press. Again, I'm not pressing the fold of the cowl because once that's on I want that to drape without falling into any permanent crease. So now I've pressed that cowl, slide that over my arms, and you can see that that's draping beautifully. The sewing is nice and close to the edge, and on the wrong side it's nice and close to the edge too. And then from the back we've got the little rouleaus waiting to have buttons attached, but we'll sew the buttons on at the end. The next step is to do the armholes. So we're going to use bias binding for the armholes. So I've got my strips of bias binding, and I'm going to take my blouse and open it out and line up the bias binding from one armhole at the side seam, and again I just like to have a little bit overlapping, and I'm going to put that under the machine with 1 centimetre seam allowance, and I'm going to sew around. Now I could do the side seams first and overlock them and press them to the back and then do the bias binding, but frankly I find this much easier, and I don't think it makes any difference to how the appearance of the blouse is. And if life's easy, that's good. So I'm moulding the bias binding to the curve of the armhole. Now again, I've mentioned this in the construction of the Cora blouse with the bias binding around the neck, that the bias binding is cut to 4 centimetres. You could use bought bias binding, and if you did, you'd be sewing in the fold. I don't pre-fold the bias binding, I don't think it's necessary. And I make it 4 centimetres just in case it stretches when I sew it, which I have found sometimes happens. So I've sewn the bias binding on the armhole. I'm going to keep it this way up, and so the seam allowance is facing away from me, and I'm going to fold the binding over onto the seam allowance, and I'm going to start sewing. And you can see I actually like to start sewing on that little tab that I've got there towards the fabric of the body of the garment, and then I do a little back tack, and I'm sewing right on the edge catching that seam allowance to the binding. I'm not ironing this first because I don't want it to stretch, and I find that ironing can sometimes do that. Even with a slippery fabric like this, this is the easiest way to do it. Back tacking and then just sewing over a little bit because I've got that extra bit of fabric, like so. Now I need to trim the seam allowance of that bias binding, so I'm going to use my duck-billed scissors, but you can use any scissors. And I'm just going to hold it flat, and on the side where the body of the blouse is and the bindings are underneath, I'm going to trim the seam allowance off. Now it is tempting to do it the other way up, but this way, if you slip, you accidentally cut the bias binding and not the body of the blouse, which I have done before, so this is experience talking to you. And trim that off. Really, you'd much rather replace the binding than have to cut out a whole new body of the blouse. Okay, I've trimmed off that seam allowance, and it's a couple of millimeters from the edge of my edge stitching line. Now I can have a look at this. So if I was to fold the binding over to the stitching line and over, that would be okay, but I feel like I would like to have a slightly narrower bias binding, especially because this is a really fine silk. So what I'm going to do is just trim off 1/2 centimetre. So you can make this judgment call if you make your own. So mine was 4 centimetres wide, but I'm trimming it back to 3.5. The other reason I like to do this is sometimes in certain areas the binding might stretch out a bit around a curve and it becomes narrower, and in places where it's a more straight it becomes wider. It's just the way it behaves. I'll trim that off. So, you know, do whatever works best for you. So you can see that's narrower now, and when I fold that over to the seam and over again, I've got a really nice, neat little bias. So I'm on the wrong side of the garment, folding the bias binding over to the seam, and again this is where that little tab comes in handy because I can start sewing on the tab. It doesn't matter if it's a bit messy there, because when I get to my actual seam, I've angled myself nicely onto the edge. So we just go ahead a little bit, maybe 10 centimetres, and then just mould that bias binding around the curve of the armhole. Sort of just doing this in stages. So I come up, I'm at the shoulder now. I slide my nail along to keep that nice and smooth. I'm not using any pins. Look at how I'm using my hands. I pause with the needle down, bring the binding over, give a little pull, slide my nail along. Again, coming into that curve of the armhole. So folded, just moulding it. I'm not stretching it at all. I'm coming off to that end, and I've got my little tab, so I've got something to hold on to. Back tacking and sewing off the edge. And there I have my binding, and that's ready for a press. And we'll do the other side. Okay, so here I have pressed my armhole bindings. I think it looks beautiful. I really do like binding made from the matching fabric, especially if it's something like silk, because it's actually would be quite chunky to use the purchased or bought bias binding. Now we're going to do the side seam, so I'm going to match the underarms, right sides together, and again I've left those tabs of the binding on because they're actually really useful with helping me sew. So I'm going to pop the fabric underneath the sewing machine. I'm going to come forward 1/2 centimetre, put the needle down, back tack, and that gives me a really clean edge. It also means when I cut those threads, they're not poking up at the edge of the seam because they're actually started below. Then I'm going to sew down, match the hem pieces together, give that a little pull so it snaps into place, and that gentle side seam curl. And I'm actually going to chain on because you know how much I love to do that. So again though, I'm going to start from the top because it's really important that that's a really crisp edge. So I'm going to just lift the foot, come 1/2 centimetre down, needle down, back tack, and carry on. And then I can just snip those threads, match the side hems together, give it a little pull to snap it into position. All the way down to the end, take that out, and now I am going to overlock my side seams and press them towards the back. I've overlocked my side seams and pressed them towards the back, but I haven't trimmed the tails off the overlocking, because a little trick that I like to do is to take a darning needle and thread those overlocking threads into this nice fat needle. It's very easy to thread, and just sew those overlocking tails back into the seam about 1.5 centimetres. Give that a little pull. It anchors the threads, stops any kind of stray threads up at that seam from showing. And then on the right side, I just sew along that line of existing stitching to secure that underarm seam. Trim those threads. And I think that looks beautifully neat and seamless. Now we're going to hem the blouse, so we'll turn it through to the right side. If you're feeling pedantic, you would actually start from the left side seam, but it doesn't actually matter. And I'm going to turn the seam allowance up 1 centimetre and then over another centimetre. So I just like to get it started under my machine with the needle down to hold it in place. And then I just come along about 10 centimetres. Now if I was just to hem and sort of randomly do it, I could very easily stretch the seam and it would twist. But if I just come along sort of 10 centimetres and just look at that little section there, fold it and hold it between my finger and thumb and give that a little pull, it just snaps into place. So I don't need to pre-press this, and I certainly wouldn't with the silk because I don't want to get a permanent crease in the wrong place. If the seam allowance moves a little bit and it's out by say 2 millimeters, I don't care about that. What I want is a nice even hem, and this material is a little bit rubbery and bouncy, so it's better to just let it do its thing. So just trim that there. Folding over once, twice, give it a little pull, slide my nail along to secure the seam and sew. that out, snip the threads. And there's my hem. So I'm just going to give that a press, and you can see I've just sewn right on the edge of the fold, and that just makes it look really neat. Now it's time to sew the buttons on. So the buttons that I'm going to be using are these beautiful little pearl shell buttons with 2 holes. Now ideally with rouleaus you'd want to use a button with a shank, but this is such delicate light fabric that these pearl buttons are perfect. So I'm going to show you how to sew them on with a shank. So I've got a nice fine needle, and I'm just threading the needle with a loop of thread and pulling that through so that I end up with 4 threads. So I'm just going to slide that down and tie a knot and trim off the ends. Now I'm going to fold. I could either use the pattern to mark the button placement, but really it's just as easy to use the rouleaus themselves, particularly if perhaps they had shifted a little bit in the sewing, or who knows. So that's one position and that's the other position. So pin on each side. And you can see with the lights coming through that where we're going to sew the button is actually where the seam allowance is. So even though it's a beautiful delicate fabric, we've actually got a bit of support there for the buttons because of the seam allowance. So I'm going to sew up about 1/2 centimetre in where my pin is. I'm going to come up and I'm just going to do a single stitch to get that in place, like so. Then I take one of my buttons and slide that along the thread, and I'm going to sew it down. And I'm just doing that quite loosely, and then I'm going to come back up and do another stitch. And because I've got 4 threads, that means I actually end up with 8 stitches in one go. And I think that that looks really neat from that side rather than doing 8 individual stitches. Then I'm going to come up underneath the button like that, and I'm just going to wrap the fabric around 3 or 4 times, and that actually creates a little shank. And then I'm going to sew back through to the wrong side, give that a gentle pull, and then just stitch in place 1, 2, 3 times. Now I'm going to make a knot again so I can sew the other button on. So just snip those threads off. And I'm going to do the same for the other button. And there where it has just sort of slightly folded with the pressing, I can then just actually use this button sewing to get that back into place. And there we have it. The little top is done. We can pop those rouleaus over the buttons just to check. Perfect. The little shank just does the job. little thread shank. The collar folds over, and our beautiful cowl neck sleeveless top is ready to go. So here it is, the finished top. I just love the cowl neck on this blouse. I think it is so elegant. So you can wear it out. It's long enough that if you wanted to, you could put a belt, little skinny belt with it to create a little bit of waist shape. I'm wearing this with my Lisa bias skirt. I sized down in this one, so normally I'd be a 12 in my patterns, but I just went down to a 10 because I just wanted a little bit more of a slinky feel. It looks great, also just with a little bit of a half tuck, that little French tuck that I love so much. Sort of keep it a little bit loose. You know how I like it to be like that. Or I can tuck it in the whole way, like so, and then pop a nice wide belt on to really sort of create some waist accent. Like so, a little bit of blousing over it. And each way it creates a different look, whether I've got that tucked in, tucked out with a belt. It can create a really different feel, but I just love these two together. I just think they're the perfect combination. What do you reckon? But I'm going to show you with a couple more options as well. So these are a pair of wide leg culottes that I drafted for myself, and they've got just a little low pleat on them with that high waist, which I think works really well with this blouse. And keeping it cash with a pair of jeans. I drafted these jeans as well. They're a couple of years old and they've got sort of nice fading going on in the seams, but I love how if you team a really smart blouse with something casual like jeans, you still look smart enough to go out, but you're just feeling comfy as well. So I can't wait to see what you do with your blouse, and please share with me at Pattern Union so I can see your makes. Have fun!